The real ending of Goodfellas wasn't witness protection in suburbia. Henry Hill walked out of a federal courtroom, and the Lucchese family erased 11 people in 5 months. That's the Ending Scorsese Cut. June 1980. Brooklyn. A dim kitchen. A single bulb. Hill waits for a phone call that will never come. Indictments are moving. Friends are disappearing. Protection, the only currency that ever mattered, is gone. In the movie, this feels cinematic. In reality, it was arithmetic. If you're ready for the story beneath the story, subscribe, and let's begin. The real Henry Hill, employee of a criminal enterprise. Henry Hill was not a boss. He was not a decision maker at the highest level. He was an earner. Born in 1943 in Brooklyn, Hill grew up orbiting the crew that operated out of the neighborhood cab stands and social clubs, tied to the Lucchese crime family. The structure above him was rigid. At the top sat the boss and underboss. Beneath them, Kappa regiments controlled crews. Soldiers answered to captains. Associates like Hill earned without formal induction, useful but ultimately disposable. The money flowed from hijackings, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and airport theft. Each operation followed quiet rules. A percentage moved up the chain. Tribute was not optional. Tribute was the price of belonging. Hill's role was logistical and opportunistic. He identified vulnerable cargo at JFK Airport, coordinated truck hijackings, and maintained relationships with fence operators who could turn stolen goods into immediate cash. Decisions were not made in chaos. They were made in meeting, sometimes over espresso, sometimes in back rooms thick with cigarette smoke. The violence existed to protect margins and enforce discipline. A missed payment, a loose conversation, a reckless addiction, each threatened the entire enterprise. Hill was not living a fantasy. He was working inside a criminal corporation with defined reporting lines, revenue targets, and consequences for failure. And when pressure came from outside, associates like him absorbed it first. The Lufthansa Heist. Windfall and structural risk. December 11, 1978. John F. Kennedy International Airport, Queens, New York. Just before 3 a.m., a crew tied to Lucchese associate James "Jimmy" Burke entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal and left with roughly $5 million in cash and jewelry, then the largest cash robbery in American history. The scale of the theft is well documented, including by Encyclopedia Britannica. Inside the organization, the number mattered more than the spectacle. $5 million in unregistered currency created immediate logistical pressure. The money had to be divided, filtered, and redistributed without triggering attention from federal investigators already monitoring airport theft. Each layer of the hierarchy expected tribute. Each participant expected his share. Large cash injections distort systems. Men spent loudly. Fur coats, new cars, visible upgrades in neighborhoods already watched by law enforcement. Profit turned into exposure. From a business standpoint, that exposure was liability, and liability had to be reduced. In the months that followed, several individuals connected to the robbery were murdered. The pattern was not impulsive violence, it was containment. Fewer participants meant fewer potential witnesses. Fewer witnesses meant reduced prosecutorial leverage. The Lufthansa heist was not simply a triumph. It destabilized the structure that enabled it. What appeared as the peak of criminal success began functioning as a stress fracture within the enterprise itself. Jimmy Burke's consolidation. Murder as accounting. After the Lufthansa robbery, Jimmy Burke faced a problem larger than profit. He had too many men who knew too much. Burke was not a made member of the Lucchese family, but he operated with its protection and understood its rules. $5 million in stolen currency had created immediate risk. Federal investigators were already circling JFK Airport. Informants existed. Pressure would come. In that environment, loyalty was not assumed. It was measured against exposure. Within weeks, members of the robbery crew began turning up dead shot in cars, discovered in garbage trucks, found in abandoned buildings across Brooklyn and Queens. The pattern was not random. It followed proximity to the heist. Drivers, handlers, men responsible for storage, each represented a potential leak. Burke was reducing variables. From a business perspective, murder functioned as internal risk management. Fewer participants meant fewer statements to prosecutors. Fewer links meant weaker conspiracy cases. It also ensured that shares did not have to be paid in full. The organization did not describe this as consolidation, but that is what it was. A violent trimming of liabilities to protect the core revenue stream. In films, the aftermath looks like paranoia spiraling out of control. In reality, it resembled accounting by elimination, profit preserved through subtraction. If this changes the way you see the story, let me know what stood out to you most. Political cover and police complicity. The quiet shield. The Lucchese family did not survive on hijackings alone. It survived because its operations existed within a protective environment shaped by influence. In 1970s New York, organized crime maintained leverage over labor unions, particularly in trucking and airport cargo handling. Control of union locals meant control of work assignments. It also meant access to information: which shipments were valuable, which guards were reliable, which warehouses were vulnerable. Bribery was part of the cost structure. Payments flowed to individual officers, inspectors, and local officials willing to look away. Favors were traded quietly. Charges were reduced. Raids were delayed. Names were passed in advance. This was not cinematic corruption. It was procedural. Relationships were cultivated over years. Dinners, envelopes, political donations routed through intermediaries. In some cases, law enforcement benefited indirectly through promotions secured by successful investigations that avoided higher-level disruption. The state presented a public narrative of aggressive prosecution, yet at street-level, coexistence often prevailed. As long as violence stayed contained and tribute moved upward, equilibrium remained. This quiet shield allowed the enterprise to function in plain sight. Cargo theft could not operate inside a major airport without blind spots. Loan sharking could not persist without selective enforcement. The system was not always controlled by organized crime, but it was frequently negotiated with it. Cocaine as expansion. Breaking the Commission's rules. By the late 1970s, cocaine was reshaping the underground economy in New York. Demand was rising. Margins were far higher than hijacked cargo or bookmaking. Cash moved faster. So did risk. For decades, elements within the American Cosa Nostra had treated narcotics as dangerous territory. Officially, many bosses discouraged involvement, fearing long federal sentences and intense investigative pressure. Whether that rule was consistently followed is debated, but the caution was real. Drugs brought attention. Yet on the street, profit overruled tradition. Henry Hill began dealing cocaine directly from his home in Rockaway, Queens. He relied on a network that included neighborhood distributors and Florida suppliers. The structure was looser than traditional mob operations. It required constant movement, trust in unreliable partners, and exposure to customers outside established circles. This was not a sanctioned expansion carefully approved by a commission. It was opportunistic growth driven by personal ambition and immediate return. Cocaine altered incentives inside the crew. Men who once depended on hijacking began operating independently. Loyalty weakened as cash bypassed established tribute channels. Discipline slipped. Addiction followed. From a business perspective, narcotics promised scale. From an organizational perspective, it threatened stability. The same revenue that fueled expansion also fractured internal cohesion and pulled federal attention closer. The enterprise had entered a market it could not fully control. The federal turn, RICO, and the business model under siege. While crews expanded into cocaine and chased faster profits, federal prosecutors were sharpening a tool designed not to chase crimes one by one, but to dismantle systems. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, had passed in 1970. By the late 1970s, it became more than a statute. It became strategy. Under traditional prosecutions, a hijacking was a hijacking. A loan sharking case stood alone. Even if convictions followed, leadership remained insulated behind layers of distance. Street-level operators absorbed sentences. The hierarchy endured. RICO altered the target. Prosecutors began arguing that organized crime families functioned as enterprises engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. Individual acts were no longer isolated incidents. They were components of a coordinated structure. If that structure could be proven, everyone tied to it could be charged collectively. Multi-agency task forces formed across New York. FBI agents worked alongside IRS investigators tracking unexplained income. Wiretaps captured conversations once assumed safe inside social clubs and private residences. Financial trails were reconstructed through shell companies, union accounts, and cash-heavy businesses. The objective shifted from proving who committed a crime to proving how the organization operated, who approved it, who received tribute, who provided insulation. Conspiracy law widened responsibility upward. Cocaine distribution further intensified pressure. Narcotics cases carried severe penalties, increasing incentives for cooperation. Lower-level associates faced decades in prison. In exchange for testimony, sentences could shrink dramatically. For families like the Lucchese organization, this approach was destabilizing. The buffers between command and execution weakened when testimony linked them directly. The government was no longer merely responding to violence. It was mapping the architecture of power and dismantling it piece by piece. For men like Henry Hill, the promise of protection sounded increasingly hollow. The decision to cooperate, survival over omertà. April 1980, Henry Hill was arrested on narcotics charges following a joint investigation by the DEA and local law enforcement in Queens. Cocaine had been seized. Surveillance had been conducted. The case against him was not speculative. It was built. If convicted, he faced a sentence long enough to remove him from the street for much of his remaining productive life. In another era, the response would have been automatic. Remain silent. Hire attorneys connected to the family. Absorb the charge. Trust that the organization would manage the fallout, shorten the damage, and restore balance after release. Protection was not charity. It was part of the operating agreement. But the conditions of 1980 were not those of a stable enterprise. The Lufthansa purge had fractured trust. Cocaine had intensified federal attention. Wiretaps and task forces were tightening around the Lucchese structure. Jimmy Burke, once a powerful buffer, was himself under pressure. The insulation between street operators and leadership had thinned. Hill understood what happened to men who became liabilities. When risk outweighed revenue, containment followed. Cooperation was not framed as betrayal in that moment. It was calculation. Prosecutors offered reduced sentencing and relocation. The federal government could guarantee prison avoidance and physical protection. The organization could guarantee neither. Silence no longer carried assurance of reward. It carried uncertainty. Omertà functioned only when the system it protected remained strong. That system was faltering. Hill chose to testify. His cooperation helped secure convictions, including that of Burke. Conversations once believed private were reconstructed in court. The enterprise absorbed the blow, but it was forced to do so without him. The code yielded to survival. Witness protection. The unseen ending. After agreeing to cooperate with federal prosecutors, Henry Hill was placed into the United States Witness Security Program. The program exists to relocate cooperating witnesses, provide them with new identities, and protect them in exchange for testimony. A framework outlined in general legal references such as Encyclopedia Britannica. For Hill, the shift was abrupt. One day he moved within a defined criminal hierarchy in New York. The next, he was relocated under a different name, in a different state, with strict limits on contact and movement. The structure that had shaped his daily existence disappeared overnight. Popular memory turns this period into dark comedy. A former gangster frustrated by ordinary life. The reality was narrower and more controlled. Financial assistance was provided, but it was regulated and temporary. Employment required discretion. Moves occurred when anonymity weakened. Every new location demanded reinvention without history. Within the Lucchese orbit, Hill had functioned inside a system of rank, income, and recognition. In witness protection, there were no captains, no tributes, no routine meetings, only case officers and conditions. His public profile complicated concealment. Media coverage followed him. Over time, repeated violations of program rules led to his removal from formal protection. There was no climactic reckoning, no violent conclusion. Instead, there was attrition of status, of stability, of identity. The organization continued without him. Leadership adjusted. Revenue streams endured. Hill survived, but survival came detached from the machinery that once gave him leverage and belonging. After the credits, what the story reveals about power. Henry Hill's world did not collapse because crime failed. It collapsed because protection failed. The structure that once insulated hijackings, loans, and cocaine profits could no longer absorb federal pressure. But organized crime did not vanish. It adjusted. Leadership changed. Methods evolved. Money continued to move through trucking firms, construction contracts, labor agreements, and informal markets. The line between legal enterprise and criminal enterprise remained difficult to see from the outside. The story behind Goodfellas is not about glamour fading. It is about how power operates when it hides inside systems, businesses, unions, politics, until exposure forces it to reorganize. If the enterprise survives by adapting, was Hill's fall a victory for justice or simply a shift in management? And when profit drives both legitimate corporations and criminal networks, how different are their survival instincts? If you want deeper examinations of organized crime and the structures behind it, subscribe and continue exploring these histories.